The key turned in the clock tower's lock, and as the world flickered, Lila heard voices from a day that hadn't yet come. But that moment was still hours away, buried like the key itself in the soft soil of tomorrow. For now, Lila Thorne knelt in her winter garden, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp December air, her fingers working through the frost-hardened earth around the base of her grandmother's rosebush. The village of Millbrook lay quiet around her, nestled in its valley, like a child curled beneath snow-white blankets. Chimney smoke rose in gentle spirals, and the distant sound of the morning train carried on the wind, a comforting rhythm that had marked the hours of her life for 37 years. Lila had inherited the locksmith shop from her father, just as he had from his father before him, and the steady tick of time had always been her companion, the measured chime of the clock tower, the reliable turn of seasons, the dependable click of tumblers falling into place. She had not expected to find the key. It lay buried 3 inches deep, its silver surface untarnished, despite what must have been years in the earth. The moment her fingers brushed its surface, a strange warmth spread up her arm, as if the metal held summer sunlight trapped within its curves. She lifted it carefully, brushing away the dark soil that clung to its intricate teeth. The teeth were shaped like tiny hourglasses. Lila had seen thousands of keys in her lifetime, had crafted hundreds with her own hands, but she had never seen anything quite like this. The metal was silver, but not silver. It seemed to shift and shimmer as she turned it in the pale morning light, sometimes appearing almost blue, sometimes catching hints of gold at its edges. The head was simple, elegant, bearing only a small engraving that looked like a clock face, though the hands seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She sat back on her heels, holding the key up to catch the light filtering through. The bare branches above, where could it have come from? Her grandmother had tended this garden for 60 years before passing it to Lila's mother, and her mother had worked the soil for another 30 before her own passing 5 years ago. If the key had been buried deliberately, it was older than living memory. If it had been lost, how had it found its way so deep into the earth? The clock tower chimed 8 times across the village, its bronze voice carrying clearly through the cold air. Lila looked up at the old stone tower that stood at Millbrook's heart, its clock face visible above the roof tines of the cottages and shops. The tower had been built in 1847, or so the plaque at its base proclaimed, though some of the older villagers whispered it was far older than that. They said it had been built on the site of an even older tower, one that had stood when Millbrook was nothing but a crossroads and a few scattered farms. Lila had never paid much attention to such stories. Her world was concrete, that needed opening, keys that needed cutting, mechanisms that obeyed the laws of physics and time. But now, holding this strange key in her palm, she felt a peculiar pull, as if something were drawing her gaze upward to where the clock hands moved in their eternal circle. She slipped the key into her coat pocket and gathered her gardening tools. The roses could wait another day. There was something she needed to check. The locksmith shop stood on Millbrook's main street, its wooden sign creaking gently in the morning breeze. Lila's father had carved that sign himself, painting the golden key that swung beneath the words Thorne and Daughter, Locksmiths. She had never changed it, even after his death, finding comfort in the continuity, in being part of something larger than herself. The shop's interior was warm and cluttered, filled with the pleasant smells of oil and metal and the faint vanilla scent of the old wood. Rows of blank keys hung from hooks along one wall, while another displayed an array of locks in various states of repair. The old leather-bound ledger lay open on her workbench, its pages filled with decades of entries in 3 different hands. Her grandfather's careful copperplate, her father's practical scrawl, and her own neat cursive. Lila lit the oil lamp on her desk and opened the heavy reference book that had belonged to her grandfather. If this key matched any known pattern, any historical design, she would find it here. She turned the pages slowly, comparing the strange key to hundreds of illustrations and photographs. Victorian door keys, medieval chest locks, ornate cabinet mechanisms from the Georgian era. Nothing matched the peculiar hourglass teeth or the shifting silver metal. She was about to close the book when a loose page fluttered to the floor. It was yellowed with age, covered in her grandfather's handwriting, but this was not his usual careful script. The words seemed rushed, urgent. The Clocktower key was lost. In 1923, during the incident, we do not speak of if it is ever found, it must not be used. The lock it opens is not in our time, it opens time itself. I have seen what happens when the hours slip their moorings. The shadows remember what we choose to forget. Below the words was a rough sketch of a key with hourglass-shaped teeth. Lila's hand trembled as she held the note. The incident we do not speak of. She had heard whispers of something that happened in 1923 before her father was born, but the older villagers had always changed the subject. When she asked, her grandfather had died when she was 12, and she had never thought to press him for details about the village's history. She looked at the key in her palm, then at the sketch. They matched perfectly. The clock tower chimed 9 times, its voice seeming different now, more insistent. Lila walked to her shop window and looked out at the tower rising above the village center. From here, she could see the narrow door at its base, always kept locked, its brass plate green with age. The village council had lost the key decades ago, or so they claimed. The tower's clock still kept perfect time, wound by some mechanism no one understood. But the interior had been sealed away since before she was born. The key in her pocket grew warm against her fingers. She tried to return to her morning routine, sorting through the requests that had come in overnight, organizing the keys that needed cutting. But her eyes kept drifting to the clock tower, and her grandfather's warning echoed in her mind. It opens time itself. What could that mean? And why did the key feel so warm, so eager, as if it wanted to be used? By 10 o'clock, Lila could stand it no longer. She locked the shop, hung the back soon sign in the window, and walked through the village streets toward the clock tower. The morning was clear and cold, with frost still glittering in the shadows, and her breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the crisp air. The tower stood in a small square, surrounded by ancient elm trees, their bare branches reaching toward the pale sky like gnarled fingers. At its base, the brass plate on the wooden door read simply "Private No Entry," but there was no additional lock beyond the old mechanism built into the door itself. Lila approached slowly, the key seeming to pulse with warmth in her palm. She could hear the clock mechanism ticking far above, a steady rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. As she drew nearer, she noticed something odd about the shadows cast by the elm trees. They seemed too long, too deep, as if the sun were setting rather than rising toward noon. She inserted the key into the lock. It slid in perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her. The metal was warm to the touch, and she could feel a faint vibration running through it, like a tuning fork struck far away. For a moment she hesitated, her grandfather's words echoing in her mind. But curiosity, that fatal flaw of all locksmiths, drove her forward. She turned the key. The world stuttered for just an instant. Everything stopped, the wind, the sound of her own breathing, even the ticking of the clock above. Then, like a film catching and starting again, reality lurched back into motion. But something had changed. The shadows fell differently now, and she could have sworn she heard voices whispering from somewhere beyond the door. The lock clicked open with a sound like breaking glass. Lila pushed the door inward and stepped into darkness that smelled of dust and time and something else, something that reminded her of the moment just before lightning strikes, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. A spiral staircase wound upward into the shadows, its stone steps worn smooth by countless feet. But at the bottom, set into the wall, was another door, smaller and stranger than the first. It was made of dark wood that seemed to absorb light, and its surface was carved with symbols that hurt to look at, directly spirals within spirals. Hourglasses that seemed too empty and fill again, clock faces with hands that moved in impossible directions. The key in her hand grew hot without conscious thought. Lila found herself kneeling before this second door, fitting the key into a lock she hadn't noticed until this moment. The metal sang as it slid home, a high, sweet note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She turned the key, and time shattered like glass. The world exploded into fragments, past, present, and future, spinning around her in a kaleidoscope of moments. She saw the village as it had been in 1923, when the streets were dirt and gas lamps flickered in the evening gloom. She saw it as it might be in years to come. The buildings changed, the people different, the standing like a sentinel over centuries of change. And she saw the shadows. They were everywhere, moving through the scattered moments like smoke. And they all had faces of people she recognized, but had never met. Faces of villagers who watched her with pleading eyes and mouths that moved in silent warnings. Stop, they seemed to say, before it's too late, before time forgets how to flow. But the key was burning in her hand now, and she could no more let go of it than she could stop her heart from beating. The fragments of time swirled faster, and she felt herself falling through them, tumbling through years and decades and centuries, while the clock tower's chime echoed endlessly around her, marking hours that had never been and might never come. When the spinning stopped, Lila found herself standing in her garden again, the key cool and innocent in her palm. The sun stood exactly where it had when she'd first found the key, and the clock tower chimed 8 times across the village. But the shadows were wrong, and in the distance she could hear voices calling her name from a day that hadn't yet come. The clock tower chimed 8 times, just as it had before. But now Lila heard the echo of other chimes layered beneath it, 9, 10, 11, a cacophony of hours that shouldn't exist together. She stood in her garden, the silver key warm in her palm, and watched the shadows dance in patterns that defied the sun's position overhead. Everything looked the same. The frost-covered rosebush, the dark soil turned where she'd been digging, the distant cottages with their smoking chimneys, all exactly as they had been when she'd first unearthed the key. But the sameness felt wrong, like a photograph trying to pass for reality. Lila walked to her garden gate and looked down the main street toward her shop. There, hanging in the window, was the back-soon sign she remembered placing there before, walking to the Clocktower. But she hadn't placed it there yet, or had she? Time felt loose around the edges, like a garment that no longer fit properly. She touched the key in her pocket and felt it pulse with that strange warmth. When she closed her eyes, she could still see the fragments of scattered time, still hear the whispered warnings of those shadow faces in the tower's depths. They had tried to tell her something, but their voices had been lost in the chaos of breaking hours. The village postman, old Mr. Henley, came cycling down the street just as he did every morning at 8:15. But as he passed, Lila noticed something that made her breath catch. His bicycle cast 3 shadows, one sharp and dark, one pale and wavering, and one that seemed to move independently of both the man and his machine. Mr. Henley nodded to her, as he always did, but his eyes held a puzzled expression, as if he were trying to remember something important that hovered just beyond recall. "Lovely morning, Miss Thorne," he called, but his voice echoed strangely, and for a moment Lila could have sworn she heard him say the words twice, with slightly different inflections. After he passed, she hurried back to her shop. The familiar space felt alien now, as if she were seeing it through glass. The old ledger lay open on her workbench to the same page as before, and her grandfather's warning note rested beside it. But when she looked closer, she noticed that the ink seemed darker, fresher, as if the words had just been written. The Clocktower key was lost in 1923 during the incident we do not speak of, the same year whispered by the shadows in the tower. What had happened then? And why could she not shake the feeling that it was happening again now because of what she had done? Lila spent the morning trying to work, but her hands shook as she handled the keys and locks. Every mechanism seemed to tick in rhythm with the Clocktower, and she began to notice that time was flowing differently around her. A simple key cutting that should have taken 5 minutes stretched to 20, while a complex lock repair seemed to finish itself in the blink of an eye. At what should have been noon, the Clocktower chimed 8 times again. Lila dropped the key she was holding and ran outside. The sun stood in the same position it had held all morning, casting the same shadows at the same angles. Mr. Henley was cycling down the street again, his bicycle throwing the same 3 shadows across the cobblestones. "Lovely morning, Miss Thorne," he called, with the same puzzled expression, the same double echo in his voice. She was trapped in 8 o'clock. The realization hit her like cold water. Somehow, by opening that impossible door in the clock, she had broken the flow of time. The hours were looping back on themselves, refusing to move forward. But she remembered the other times, 9, 10, 11 layered beneath the dominant 8. Perhaps other hours were happening simultaneously, overlapping like transparent sheets of glass. That afternoon, though, it remained 8 o'clock. According to every clock in the village, Lila began to notice the other temporal layers more clearly. She caught glimpses of the village at different hours. The milk wagon making its afternoon rounds, while the morning frost still glittered on the ground. Lamplight flickering in windows, while the sun shone overhead. of children playing in the square. Though she could see their mothers hanging, washing that suggested it was early morning, and there were the shadows, not just the multiple shadows cast by solid objects, but the shadow people she had seen in the tower. They moved through the village streets like memories made visible, always at the edge of her vision, always trying to tell her something she couldn't quite hear. As the trapped day wore on, Lila began to understand that she wasn't the only one affected. The villagers were growing confused, disoriented. Mrs. Pemberton, who ran the tea shop, served the same customer 4 times in what seemed like minutes, each time forgetting the previous interaction. The church bells, which normally chimed on the quarter hour, had fallen silent, as if even they could not make sense of the temporal chaos. But the strangest thing was how empty the village was becoming. Not physically empty. The same people moved through the same routines, caught in their own loops of 8 o'clock. But there was a flatness to them, as if they were becoming less real with each repetition. Their voices grew fainter, their movements more mechanical, their eyes increasingly vacant. Only Lila seemed to retain her full substance, her complete awareness, and with that awareness came the growing certainty that each loop was taking something from the village, draining it of reality, like water seeping from a cracked vessel. She had to return to the clock tower. The key in her pocket had grown warm again, almost hot against her leg. As she walked through the village square, she noticed that the shadow people were more visible now, more solid. They gathered around the base of the clock tower like mourners at a grave, their faces turned upward toward the frozen clock. When she approached, they turned to her, and this time she could hear their whispers clearly. "You must unlock what you have locked. The key turns both ways, before the village fades completely, before we all become shadows." One of the figures stepped forward, and Lila gasped. It was a man in a locksmith's apron, his face weathered and kind, his eyes the same gray as her own. She had seen those features in old photographs. This was her great-grandfather, the first locksmith in the Thorne family line. "You found the key," he said, and his voice was like wind through autumn leaves, "as I knew you would, eventually, as I did in 1923. You." Lila stepped closer, though the shadow man seemed to flicker at the edges. "You opened the door before. I was curious, as all locksmiths are, as you were. The key calls to our bloodline. We made it. You see, long ago, my great-grandfather and I, we made it for the tower's builder, who wanted to step outside time to see the village's future, to watch over it through all the years to come. But something went wrong. Something always goes wrong when mortals try to master time. The builder became trapped between moments, and the key was lost. When I found it again, I thought I could control it, use it safely. Instead, I created the first loop, trapped 1923 in an endless repetition of a single day." Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "How did you escape?" "I didn't. None of us did. Not really. We broke free of the loop, but part of us remained trapped, became these shadows you see. Every time the key is used, more of the village's reality bleeds away. More of its people become caught between what was and what might be." Around them, the other shadows nodded sadly. Lila recognized some of the faces, now villagers, from old photographs, people who had died decades ago, but who seemed more solid, more present than the living people trapped in the 8 o'clock loop. "How do I stop it?" she asked, Her great-grandfather's shadow smiled sadly. The key turns both ways, granddaughter. But be warned, in locking, time comes with its own price. You must choose what you're willing to sacrifice to save what remains. He began to fade as he spoke, becoming transparent like smoke in sunlight. Remember, the door in the tower has 2 locks. You opened the first, which trapped time. But there is a second lock, deeper in the tower, where time's true heart beats. The key will open that as well. But his voice was barely a whisper now, carried away by wind that touched nothing else. But what? Lila called after him. But someone must stay behind to keep the door closed. Someone must become the guardian, as the builder meant to be. Someone must step outside time to ensure it keeps flowing for everyone else. The shadow scattered like leaves, and Lila stood alone in the square, the key burning in her palm like a coal from some impossible fire above her. The clock tower chimed 8 times once more, but now she could hear the other hours clearly, the times that were trying to exist simultaneously, all the moments that were fighting to break free from this temporal prison she had created. She looked up at the tower's face and saw that the hands were moving not forward, but in all directions, at once spinning and stuttering as time tried to find its proper flow. And in the depths of that ancient mechanism, she could hear something calling to her, something that sounded like her own voice echoing across decades she had yet to live. The second lock was waiting. The door at the base of the clock tower stood open as Lila approached, revealing the spiral staircase that wound upward into darkness. But now she could see another passage, one that led downward, its steps carved from stone so old it seemed to absorb light itself. The key in her pocket pulsed with warmth, drawing her toward the descending path. The whispers of the shadow people followed her as she entered the tower. Their voices blended together like a sad chorus, speaking of time lost and found, of hours that had slipped their moorings, and days that had forgotten how to end. Among them she could still hear her great-grandfather's fading words. Someone must stay behind to keep the door closed. As she descended the stone steps, Lila felt the weight of the tower pressing down around her. The walls were lined with symbols, similar to those on the door she had opened, but these were older, more complex, carved so deeply into the stone that they seemed to extend beyond the surface into some realm her eyes could not follow. The air grew thick with the scent of time itself, dust and metal, and the electric charge of moments about to be born. The staircase ended at a circular chamber, deep beneath the village. At its center stood a massive mechanism, far more complex than any clockwork Lila had ever seen. Gears turned within gears, springs coiled and released in rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeats of everyone in Millbrook. And at the very heart of it all was a lock unlike any other. This lock was made of the same shifting silver as the key, but it was enormous, as wide as Lila could spread her arms. Its surface was covered in hourglass shapes that actually moved, sand flowing upward and downward in impossible loops, marking time that had been and time that might be. Around the lock, the mechanism hummed and clicked, and Lila realized she was looking at the true source of the clock tower's power, not just a timepiece, but a machine that regulated the flow of time itself through the village. Standing before the great lock was a figure she had not expected to see. He was tall and elegant, dressed in clothes that might have been fashionable in any era from the past 3 centuries. His hair was silver white, his face unlined, despite eyes that held the weight of countless years. When he turned to face her, Lila saw that he flickered slightly, like a reflection on disturbed water. "So you are the one," he said, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed across centuries. "The locksmith who has awakened the key after all these years." "You're the builder," Lila said, though she wasn't sure how she knew. "The one who commissioned the key." He nodded slowly. "Lord Aldrich Blackwood, last of my line, architect of this tower, and guardian of this mechanism, though guardian implies a choice I was never given." He gestured to his flickering form. "I have been trapped here since 1847, caught between moments, watching over a village that grows more distant with each passing year. My great-grandfather said someone must stay to keep the door closed. Your great-grandfather understood the price, though he was fortunate his sacrifice was temporary. When he opened the first lock in 1923, creating the loop you experienced, I was able to contain the damage by accepting his place as guardian. He returned to the living world, though part of him remained here as one of the shadow folk you've seen." Blackwood moved closer to the great mechanism, his hand hovering over controls that seemed to shift and change even as Lila watched. "But now you have opened the first lock again, and the loops are multiplying. Soon, not just 8 o'clock will be trapped, but all hours, all days. Time will knot itself into impossible patterns, and reality will begin to unravel." Lila could feel it happening even as he spoke. The key in her pocket was growing hotter, and she could hear the Clocktower's chime beginning to fracture above them. Mate strikes, becoming 9, becoming 7, becoming numbers that had no names. The mechanism around them was spinning faster, its gears clicking with increasing urgency. "Then I'll unlock it," she said, pulling the key from her pocket. It was almost too hot to hold now, its silver surface blazing with inner light. "I'll open the second lock and set time free." "You don't understand." Blackwood's form solidified slightly, his eyes boring into hers. "Opening the second lock doesn't free time, it releases it entirely. Every moment that has ever been or ever could be would exist simultaneously. The village would experience its entire history at once, birth and death, construction and decay, every joy and sorrow layered one atop another until nothing remained but chaos. Then what's the answer? Someone must take my place. Someone must step outside time to become its guardian, to ensure the mechanism runs smoothly, to keep the hours flowing in their proper order. Your great-grandfather was willing, but I spared him because his time in the world was not yet finished. But now," Lila looked at the great lock, at the key in her burning palm, at the machine that controlled the heartbeat of time itself. She thought of the village above, of the people trapped in their 8 o'clock loop, growing fainter and less real with each repetition. She thought of Mr. Henley cycling past with his 3 shadows, of Mrs. Pemberton forgetting her customers, of all the small, precious moments of ordinary life that were bleeding away into temporal chaos. "What would happen to me?" she asked. "You would become like me, caught between moments, existing in all times and no time. You would watch over the village as I have done, ensuring that its people live their lives in proper sequence, that their days unfold as they should. You would be guardian and prisoner both, essential but invisible, remembered by none but the shadows who would eventually join you." The mechanism's humming was growing louder, more urgent. Above them, Lila could hear the clock tower's chime beginning to stutter and multiply. 8 becoming 80, becoming 800, becoming a sound that threatened to shatter the foundations of reality itself. "How long?" she whispered. "Until another locksmith finds the key and faces the same choice. Perhaps decades, perhaps centuries. Time moves differently for those who guard it." Lila closed her eyes and saw the village as it had been in the fragments of her temporal vision, generations of people living their lives in the simple rhythm of passing days. Children growing into adults, seasons turning in their ancient dance. The steady comfort of time's proper flow. She thought of her shop, of the keys she had cut and the locks she had opened, of the small but essential role she had played in keeping the mechanisms of ordinary life running smoothly. And she thought of the shadow people, the parts of past guardians that lingered on, still trying to protect the village, even from their ethereal state. Her great-grandfather among them, who had been willing to make this sacrifice until Blackwood had taken his place. The key was singing now, a high, clear note that seemed to resonate through her bones. The great lock pulsed with silver light, its hourglass shapes spinning faster and faster as time struggled against its constraints. "If I do this," Lila said, "will they be free? All of them? Will time flow properly again? Yes, the loops will end. The hours will resume their proper sequence, and the village will heal. Reality will stabilize, and the people you've watched growing thin will regain their substance. And you," Blackwood smiled sadly, "I will finally be able to rest, to move on to whatever comes after, as I should have done more than a century ago." The mechanism gave a great shuddering groan, and cracks appeared in the stone walls around them. Time was running out literally. The pressure of all those trapped hours was building beyond what the ancient system could contain. Lila stepped forward and placed the key in the great lock. It fit perfectly, as she had known it would. The moment the metal touched metal, she felt the full weight of time pressing against her consciousness. Every second that had ever ticked past in Millbrook, every moment that was trying to be born, every hour that hung suspended in the chaos. Above. "Turn it slowly," Blackwood advised, his form beginning to brighten as if lit from within. "Let time settle gradually back into its proper flow. And remember, once you turn the key, there is no going back." Lila nodded. She thought of her quiet shop, of her garden, where she had found the key that morning. Was it centuries ago? She thought of the life she was giving up, the future she would never see, the simple pleasures of existing in time's flow rather than standing outside it. But she also thought of Mr. Henley's confused smile, of the children who should be playing in the square, of all the small miracles of ordinary time that were slowly dissolving into nothing. She began to turn the key. The mechanism responded immediately, its frantic spinning beginning to slow into a more measured rhythm. The cracks in the walls sealed themselves, and the air grew lighter as the pressure of trapped time began to ease. Above them, the clock tower's chime settled back into its proper 8 strikes, clear and true. But as the key turned, Lila felt herself beginning to change. Her body grew lighter, less solid, while her awareness expanded to encompass the entire flow of time through the village. She could see every moment simultaneously, past, present, and future, spreading out like a vast tapestry that she could read and tend and guard. Blackwood was fading now. his form becoming transparent with relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, and his voice carried the joy of someone finally allowed to rest after an impossibly long vigil. "The village is safe. Time will flow as it should." As he disappeared entirely, Lila felt the full weight of guardianship settle upon her. She was connected now to every clock in the village, every heartbeat, every moment of change and growth. She could see her neighbors resuming their lives above the confusion clearing from their eyes as time resumed its proper course. The key completed its turn with a sound like a distant bell, and the great lock sealed itself once more. The mechanism settled into its eternal rhythm, and Lila found herself becoming part of that rhythm, her consciousness woven into the very fabric of temporal flow. She was the guardian now, the keeper of ours, the silent sentinel who would ensure that time moved as it should for all the people she had chosen to save. And in the depths of the clock tower, surrounded by the gentle ticking of gears that counted out the moments of ordinary life, Lila Thorne began her watch that would last until another locksmith found the key and faced the choice she had made. Time, Lila discovered, was not the smooth, flowing river she had always imagined. From her new perspective as guardian of the clock tower's mechanism, she could see it for what it truly was, a vast, complex web of interconnected moments, each one delicate as spider's silk, each one requiring constant tending to maintain the illusion of linear progression. Days passed, or perhaps years, for time moved differently for her now, and she learned to read the subtle rhythms of the village above. She could feel Mrs. Pemberton's tea shop opening each morning at precisely 8:15, could sense the steady heartbeat of Mr. Henley as he made his postal rounds, could track the seasonal migration of birds overhead as they followed patterns laid down over centuries. Her body had become something between flesh and shadow, solid enough to tend the great mechanism, but ethereal enough to step between moments when necessary. She found she could move through the village unseen, a presence felt but never quite observed, ensuring that the delicate clockwork of daily life continued to turn smoothly. The hardest part was the solitude. Blackwood had not lied when he warned her of isolation. She could observe the villagers, could influence their lives in small ways, a clock that ran fast here, a door that stuck there, tiny adjustments that kept the flow of time smooth, but she could not truly interact with them. They passed through her awareness like dreams, vivid but untouchable sometimes. In the deepest hours of night, when the village slept, she would climb to the top of the clock tower and look out over Millbrook's rooftops. The view never changed, but she began to see the layers of history beneath the present moment. She could watch the village as it had been in centuries past, could glimpse possible futures spreading out like branches from a tree, could see the ghost paths of roads never built and buildings never constructed. It was during one of these midnight vigils that she first sensed something was wrong. The disturbance was subtle. At first, slight irregularity in the mechanism's rhythm, a brief stutter in the flow of time through the village's eastern edge. Lila descended into the chamber beneath the tower and studied the great clockwork with growing concern. One of the smaller gears, no larger than her palm, had developed a hairline crack that pulsed with silver light. She had been guardian for what felt like decades, though she could never be certain of the actual time that had passed. The crack suggested that her vigil was taking its toll on the ancient mechanism. Every guardian who had served before her Blackwood her great-grandfather during his brief tenure, and others whose shadows she sometimes glimpsed in the towers. Depths had left their mark on the system that regulated time itself. The crack was growing. Over the following days, Lila watched it spread with the patience of someone who existed outside time's normal flow. The gear's rotation became increasingly erratic, and she began to notice corresponding effects in the village above. A clock in the bakery ran slow, causing the morning bread to be late. The church bells skipped their noon chime entirely. Most troubling of all, she caught glimpses of temporal echoes, brief flashes, where past and present overlapped, where she could see the village, as it had been layered over the village as it was. She tried to repair the gear using the tools and knowledge she had inherited as a locksmith, but her hands passed through the mechanism like smoke. The clockwork that regulated time could only be maintained by someone fully anchored in the temporal flow, and she was no longer entirely part of that flow. The realization struck her with the force of inevitability. She was not the final guardian. She was merely another link in a chain that stretched back to the tower's construction and forward into an uncertain future. Eventually, every guardian would leave their mark on the mechanism until it could no longer function properly. And when that happened, she didn't want to think about what would happen when the clock tower finally failed entirely. The answer came to her in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across time. During her explorations of the tower's deepest chambers, she had found records left by previous guardians' notes scratched into stone, messages carved into the mechanism itself, desperate warnings preserved in metal and shadow. The tower was not just regulating time for Millbrook. It was part of a vast network connected to other towers, other mechanisms, other villages scattered across the world. Each one maintained the flow of time in its region, and each one was slowly failing. As the weight of centuries accumulated in their clockwork hearts, Lila began to understand the true scope of what she guarded. The temporal loops, the shadow people, the gradual erosion of reality. These were symptoms of a system that had been pushed beyond its limits. The original builders had created something magnificent and terrible, a way to harness time itself. But they had not foreseen the cumulative effect of centuries of operation. One night, as she watched the cracked gear struggle through another rotation, Lila felt a presence behind her. She turned to see a figure she recognized from old photographs, a woman in Victorian dress, her face kind but worn with the weight of years. "You're beginning to understand," the shadow woman said. Her voice carried the echo of someone who had spoken the same words many times before. "I was guardian here before Blackwood, before any of the others you've seen. I was the first to notice the cracks." "How long do we have?" Lila asked. "Not long. Perhaps a few more decades in your counting. Perhaps less. The mechanism grows more unstable with each passing season. Soon, the damage will cascade beyond our ability to contain it. And then," the shadow woman gestured to the great clockwork around them, "then time itself will begin to unravel. Not just here, but everywhere the network extends. Minutes will stretch into hours, days will collapse into seconds, and the careful order that keeps reality stable will dissolve into chaos." Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's ancient stones. "There must be something we can do." "There is. But it requires a sacrifice greater than any guardian has yet made." The shadow woman moved closer to the mechanism, her translucent, form flickering between different ages, sometimes young, sometimes old, sometimes nothing more than a shimmer in the air. The network can be stabilized, but only by someone willing to become part of it entirely. Not just a guardian of one tower, but a living conduit through which time itself flows. What does that mean? It means becoming time, in a sense, spreading your consciousness through the entire network, using your life force to reinforce every failing mechanism, every cracking gear, every stuttering pendulum. You would exist everywhere and nowhere, keeping the flow of time stable across the world. Lila stared at the great lock that had brought her to this place, at the key that still hung from its center like a silver star. And the cost: you would cease to exist as an individual. Your memories, your identity, your sense of self-fall of it would be subsumed into the greater flow. You would become the heartbeat of time itself, but you would no longer be you. The chamber fell silent, except for the labored ticking of the damaged mechanism. Lila thought of the village above, of all the villages connected to this ancient network, of millions of people living their lives in blissful ignorance of the temporal infrastructure that made their existence possible. She thought of children being born, of lovers meeting for the first time, of families gathering around dinner tables, of all the small, precious moments that gave meaning to the passage of days. She thought of seasons changing, of flowers blooming and fading, of the eternal dance of growth and decay that required time's steady flow to remain beautiful rather than chaotic. "How do I do it?" she asked. The shadow woman smiled sadly. "The key that brought you here can be turned one final time. But instead of opening or closing the lock, it will integrate your essence with the mechanism itself. You will become the network's new foundation, the stable core around which all time revolves. Will anyone remember? The shadows will remember for a while, and somewhere in the deepest archives of time itself, your sacrifice will be recorded. But to the living world, you will become invisible, just another force of nature that people take for granted, like gravity, like the rising of the sun, like the beating of their own hearts." Lila nodded slowly. She had always been drawn to the mechanisms that made life possible, the hidden clockwork that people rarely noticed until it stopped working. Perhaps this was simply the ultimate expression of that calling to become part of the greatest mechanism of all. But first, she had something she needed to do, with effort that felt like swimming upstream against time itself. Lila projected her consciousness back to the village above. She found her way to her old shop, still locked and empty after all the years or decades of her absence. The back soon sign hung faded in the window, and dust covered the workbench where she had once cut keys and repaired locks. She focused all her remaining connection to the physical world and managed to write a single note, her ghostly fingers barely able to grip the pen. "To whoever finds this shop, I have gone to tend a greater lock, one that keeps time itself in order. The village is safe, the hours will flow as they should, and the small mechanisms of daily life will continue to turn. Remember that every lock opened is a trust kept, every key cut is a promise made. Take care of the simple things, for they are what make the complex things possible. L. Thorne, Locksmith." She left the note on her workbench, beside her grandfather's old ledger, where someday another locksmith might find it and understand something of what she had chosen. Then she returned to the depths of the clock tower, to the great mechanism and the patient shadow woman who who waited beside it. "I'm ready," Lila said. The shadow woman nodded and began to fade. "Turn the key one final time and let time itself flow through you. The network will stabilize, the cracks will heal, and the world above will continue its dance of days and seasons." Lila approached the great lock and grasped the silver key. It was warm now, not with the fever heat of temporal chaos, but with the gentle warmth of life itself. As she turned it slowly clockwise, she felt her consciousness begin to expand. At first, she was still herself, but larger aware of the clock tower's mechanism, then of the village, then of the network of towers that stretched across the world like a vast web of silver threads. She could feel every clock ticking in perfect synchronization, every heartbeat following time's rhythm, every moment flowing smoothly into the next dot as the key completed its final turn. Lila felt herself dissolving into that flow, becoming part of the current that carried all of existence forward through the endless river of time. Her individual thoughts scattered like leaves on the wind, but in their place came something greater, awareness of time itself, a deep understanding of the delicate balance that kept reality stable and beautiful. The mechanism around her began to glow with renewed strength. The cracked gear healed itself, the stuttering rhythms smoothed into perfect harmony. And throughout the network, failing clockworks suddenly ran like new. Lila Thorne, Locksmith of Millbrook, ceased to exist as a person, but time itself gained. A steady heartbeat, a careful guardian who would ensure that every second, every minute, every hour flowed as it should for as long as the world turned beneath the stars in the village above. The clock tower chimed 9 times, clear and true, and life continued its eternal dance through the gift of measured moments, in the spaces between seconds, in the pause between heartbeats, in the breath held before the first word of a love song. Lila existed everywhere and nowhere at once. She had become time's conscious current, flowing through the vast network of clockwork that kept reality stable across the world. From her new perspective, she could perceive the earth as a living clock, its rotation marking the grandest hours, its orbit counting the most sublime seasons. Cities rose and fell in what felt like moments, generations flowing past like water, but every individual life burned bright in her awareness, precious, brief, and essential to the greater pattern. She could feel other consciousnesses like her, own scattered throughout the temporal network, the echoes of guardians who had made the same choice in ages past. They were part of time's flow now. Their individual voices blended into a vast choir that sang the hours into existence. Together, they maintained the delicate balance that allowed causality to function, prevented paradoxes from unraveling reality, and ensured that every moment arrived precisely when it should. But even as she embraced her new existence, Lila remained connected to Millbrook in ways she had not expected. Perhaps because it was there that she had first turned the key, or perhaps because love itself created threads that even time could not entirely sever. She found herself paying special attention to the small village where her mortal life had ended. She watched over her neighbors with the patience of someone who existed. Outside the normal flow of days, Mr. Henley continued his postal rounds for 7 more years before retiring to tend a garden that would have made Lila's grandmother proud. Mrs. Pemberton passed the tea shop to her niece, who painted the walls a cheerful yellow and added fresh flowers to every table. Children grew into adults, fell in love, had children of their own, and the eternal cycle continued with the rhythm of a perfectly calibrated clock. Most surprisingly, Lila discovered that her old shop did not remain empty. 3 years after her disappearance, though the villagers remembered it vaguely, as if through fog, their memories softened by time's own protective mechanisms, a young man arrived in Millbrook with a battered toolkit and calloused hands. His name was Thomas Gray, and he had learned the locksmith's trade in the great cities before growing tired of their noise and complexity. He was drawn to the quiet village by something he could not name, a pull that led him directly to the empty shop with its faded back soon sign. When Thomas found Lila's note on the dusty workbench, he read it with the reverence of someone recognizing a kindred spirit. He understood, perhaps better than most, that every lock was indeed a trust, every key a promise. He settled into the shop as if it had been waiting for him, and soon the familiar sounds of filing and cutting filled the air once more. From her position outside time, Lila watched Thomas work with growing affection. He had the same careful attention to detail that had marked her own craftsmanship, the same respect for the mechanisms that made daily life possible. But more than that, he had something she had always lacked, an easy way with people that made the villagers feel welcome in the shop, that turned routine transactions into friendly conversations. Under Thomas's care, the locksmith shop became more than just a place of business. It became a gathering spot where neighbors could share news and gossip, where children could watch in fascination as keys took shape under skilled hands, where the elderly could sit by the warm stove and tell stories of the village's past. And sometimes, when Thomas worked late into the evening with only the oil lamp for company, Lila found she could almost make herself visible, not quite solid, but present enough to guide his hand when he struggled with a particularly difficult lock, to whisper suggestions that he heard as inspiration, to ensure that her grandfather's tools continued to serve their purpose in worthy hands. It was during one such evening, as Thomas puzzled over an antique music box that refused to open, that he spoke aloud to the seemingly empty shop. "I don't know if you're still here somehow, Miss Thorne," he said, his voice careful and respectful, "but I want you to know that I'm taking good care of your place. The village, too, they all speak of you kindly, though they can't quite remember why you left." Lila felt a warmth spread through the shop, a gentle presence that made the shadows dance and the lamp flame burn steadier. "I found more of your notes," Thomas continued, his fingers still working delicately with the music box's mechanism. "Hidden in the bottom of the tool chest, tucked between the pages of the ledger. You were working on something before you disappeared, weren't you? Something about keys that open more than doors." The music box suddenly clicked and its lid sprang open. A tiny dancer began to spin to a melody that seemed to echo with harmonies beyond the purely mechanical, as if time itself were keeping rhythm with the little clockwork figure. Thomas smiled and set the music box aside. "Thank you," he said simply, and Lila knew he understood more than he was saying. Years flowed past like water, and Lila watched the village change and grow while remaining essentially itself. New houses were built using old methods. Young people moved away to seek their fortunes, but often returned to raise families, and the clock tower continued to mark the hours with bronze voice that never faltered. But her awareness extended far beyond Millbrook now. She could feel the pulse of great cities where millions of hearts beat in approximate synchronization, could sense the slow turning of seasons across vast continents, could perceive the delicate dance of celestial bodies as they traced their eternal paths through space and time. She became aware that the network she now helped sustain was not the work of any single civilization. The clock towers and temporal mechanisms had been built across centuries by different peoples, each contributing their own understanding of time's nature to the greater whole. Egyptian water clocks had evolved into Roman sundials, which had grown into medieval mechanical timepieces, which had finally transformed into the metaphysical engines that now regulated time itself. Each culture had left its mark on the network, and Lila found herself learning from guardians who had served in ages long past, Troman engineers who had first discovered how to forge temporal gears, Chinese philosophers who had mapped the flow of hours through human consciousness, Islamic astronomers who had calculated the precise frequencies needed to harmonize earthly time with cosmic rhythms. She was part of an ancient tradition now, a chain of consciousness that stretched back to humanity's first attempts to measure and understand the passage of moments. And like those who had come before her, she found purpose in the work itself, in keeping the great mechanism running smoothly, in ensuring that time remained humanity's faithful servant rather than its chaotic master. But perhaps the greatest joy of her new existence came from the small moments she could still touch. A clock that needed winding at just the right moment to prevent someone from being late for an important appointment. A traffic light that held green for an extra second to allow young lovers to cross the street hand in hand. A grandfather clock that chimed softly in the night to comfort a child afraid of the dark. These tiny interventions required such a small expenditure of her consciousness that she could make hundreds of them every day without affecting the network's stability. And each one reminded her that time was not just an abstract force, but the medium through which all of life's meanings were expressed. Decades passed, or perhaps centuries. From her perspective, the distinction had little meaning. Thomas aged gracefully, training a successor of his own before passing, peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning when the village was bright with apple blossoms. The new locksmith was a woman named Sarah Chen, who brought her own innovations to the craft, while respecting the traditions Thomas had maintained. And still, the clock tower stood at Millbrook's heart, its mechanism running with perfect precision, its chimes marking hours that flowed as smoothly as a river toward the sea. The villagers who heard those chimes never suspected that each note was shaped by the consciousness of someone who had once lived among them, who had chosen to become part of time itself so that their simple, precious lives could continue uninterrupted. Sometimes, in the depths of winter, when snow muffled all sound and the village lay sleeping under starlight, Lila would gather her scattered awareness and remember what it had been like to have a body, to feel cold air on her skin, to taste hot tea on a December morning. The memories were distant now, like dreams, half remembered upon waking, but they remained beautiful because they had been real, because they had been lived rather than merely observed. And in those quiet moments, she would send a gentle pulse through the network, a reminder to her fellow guardians across the world that their sacrifice had meaning, that the mechanisms they maintained served not abstract principles, but real people who loved and hoped and dreamed within time's careful embrace. The network pulsed back with harmonies that spoke of rice fields in Asia, where farmers worked to rhythms older than recorded history, of great libraries in Africa, where scholars studied the mathematics of temporal flow, of Arctic research stations, where scientists measured time's passage against the spin of distant stars. Every culture, every corner of human experience was connected through the web of consciousness that kept time stable and true as the years accumulated into decades, and decades into centuries. Lila felt herself becoming something beyond what she had ever imagined possible. She was no longer the village locksmith who had found a strange key in her garden. She was part of time itself now, a conscious thread in the vast tapestry that allowed reality to exist in ordered sequence rather than chaotic simultaneity. But at her core, in the deepest part of her transformed consciousness, she remained what she had always been: a keeper of keys, a tender of mechanisms, someone who understood that the most important locks were often the ones people never saw, and that the greatest keys were those that opened not doors but possibilities. The clock tower chimed midnight over Millbrook, its voice carrying clearly through the winter air to every corner of the sleeping village. In houses lit by warm lamplight, families gathered around their hearths, children dreamed of snow angels and summer afternoons, and lovers promised each other tomorrows that time would faithfully deliver. And in the spaces between the seconds, in the pause between one breath and the next, Lila smiled with satisfaction that transcended individual identity. The great work continued. Time flowed as it should, and all the small, beautiful moments of human existence remained possible because someone had been willing to step outside time to keep it running. The key had unlocked not just a door, but eternity itself, and in that vastness, love and sacrifice had become the gears that turned the universe's greatest clock into the key that unlocked time. Thank you for listening to this dark locksmith story for sleep. Close your eyes now and let time carry you gently into dreams, knowing that somewhere in the spaces between moments, someone is keeping watch to ensure that every second unfolds exactly as it should.